A while ago, I was lucky enough to have Hal Whitehead as an interview partner to talk about marine conservation and other issues. And while he's a world-renowned expert on sperm whales, on that occasion I also asked him a couple of questions about harbor porpoises. So here's what he said about this fascinating species. Have you ever seen sperm whales together with harbor porpoise?
No, I haven't. Typically, sperm whales are thought of as deep water creatures, so we rarely see them in less than 1,000 meters deep. And harbor porpoise are typically thought of as shallow water species, so we rarely see them in water, say, deeper than 200 meters. But that said, they do have overlapping ranges, and so we have seen them in our work here off Nova Scotia, 100 miles off the coast, or on the edge of the continental shelf, where there are a bunch of sperm whales there, and we have occasionally seen harbor porpoise out there, but not as far as I remember with the sperm whales. Yeah. And there was a remarkable study done in Greenland where they put satellite transmitters on harbor porpoises in Greenland and found a bunch of them went off into the deep waters of the Labrador Sea, where there are certainly sperm whales there. So yeah, harbor porpoises, I mean, we think of, tend to think of them as these, especially on this coast where we've got all these other species, and harbor porpoises are sort of right down the bottom of the list of what anyone wants to study. Right whales are number one, and humpbacks number two, and then you get northern bottlenose whales and pilot whales and so on, and then there's some harbor porpoises around. So we don't know much about them here, and it's different in the Baltic, and the scientists around the Baltic have learned all kinds of things about them, and they're quite fascinating creatures.
There is indications that harbor porpoise do have dialects. Do you think that would qualify them for also being cultural animals? And if so, wouldn't their culture necessarily be completely different from other cetaceans?
Yeah, I mean, dialects don't necessarily need to be cultural. So, for instance, if you look at birdsong dialects, many of them with the passerines are cultural. So a bird brought up by itself doesn't know what to sing. For some bird species, they aren't cultural. So a bird brought it up by itself does know what to sing. So it could theoretically be either way. But my guess is with cetaceans, it is almost always, perhaps always cultural. And the chance that there are genetic differences between these groups of harbor porpoise, which set up the differences in dialects, seems pretty unlikely to me. So the fact that there are these dialect differences do suggest, A, that there's culture, and B, that this culture indicates demarcations in the harbor porpoise population, which we should consider when we're thinking about how to conserve them.
The harbor porpoise is one of the animals that has to suffer from bycatch on a global basis, probably more than any other species on this planet. Bycatch, being caught in a net, obviously is a very bad thing to happen to a cetacean, and that can happen to sperm whales as well. What do you think could be possible solutions to the bycatch issue?
Well, yeah, you're totally right. Bycatch is one of the biggest, perhaps the biggest issue for many cetacean species, and including harbor porpoise. I've seen so many dead harbor porpoises because of being stuck in nets. As well as other species too, but harbor porpoise is sometimes it seems you saw more dead ones from bycatch than you see living ones out there in the ocean. Well, I think the solutions are, or the ways of ameliorating it, to do with regulating fishing, and so the nets and lines and so on that they get caught in. We need to figure out how people can make a sustainable living from fishing without catching these animals that we don't want them to catch, and generally they don't want to catch either. And so some of the things that people are working on are changes to gear, using gear, for instance, here in this area, there's a great deal of concern about bycatch of right whales, which are having a really hard time. And so people are working on using fishing gear which doesn't have a line up to the surface, which gets caught in right whales, perhaps a bit less harbor porpoises. Harbor porpoises, I think it's more nets, but that's one way forward. Another thing that's relatively easy but resisted by a lot of the fishing industry is to have good observers on the fishing boats, so that we do have really good records of where these things are happening. So if we know where and when these things are happening, we can start to say, okay, you start fishing a month earlier and end a month earlier, and you won't overlap with the harbor porpoises as much, or something like that. So if we have really good data about what's happening, we can try and manage the fishing to minimize its effect on harbor porpoises, as well as all the other species that are getting caught in, by this gear, which the fishermen don't want.
Right. Yeah, so it's all about adapting our behavior to what we find in nature, and in this case, with the behavior of and the distribution of harbor porpoises. It has often been said that the porpoises and maybe other cetaceans don't see or don't hear, don't perceive the nets underwater. I've just talked to a UK researcher who had observed the animals' movement around nets by via the recordings they did with underwater hydrophones that were attached to the nets, and he said that they were apparently quite aware of these nets, and they even did seem to interact with the nets. So it doesn't seem to be a matter of not being able to see these monofilament nets, which you can imagine are almost invisible even to an animal that has a sophisticated echolocation capability. But yeah, there seems to be other causes as well. So my last question would refer to the role of cetaceans in the oceans. There's an increasing discussions about ecosystem functioning and ecosystem services from the oceans in general, and also from cetaceans, and that cetaceans play a vital role in the seas, and that they even are helping us to combat climate change. What is your view on that?
Yeah, well, the evidence looks like that is happening. I mean, we're still pretty unsure about these things, but I think one of the, to me, one of the most telling examples may be in the Antarctic, where the Antarctic is iron limited, right? So there's not enough iron in the surface waters to promote as much plankton growth as could happen. And so they've done these experiments where they dump iron and find the plankton grows wonderfully. But there, sorry?
Ecosystem.
Yeah, that's, and then that's a kind of dubious way to, because it does have other effects as well. But so what's happening in the Antarctic and in some other parts of the world is the iron that is there gets assimilated into the phytoplankton, and then when the phytoplankton dies or is eaten by the zooplankton, which dies, or is eaten by something else which dies, they sink down, and so it all ends up at the bottom where it hangs out, and so you get reduction of iron and sometimes other nutrients at the surface. Now, down at the bottom here, feeding on all this detritus that has fallen down is a whole real ecosystem, and doing pretty well because it's got all this good stuff coming down, but less than it would have if there was more productivity at the surface. So if you take an animal like the sperm whale, which is feeding down in this deep ecosystem and eating these things down there, which are themselves using the detritus as the basis of their food chain, then and then they come up to the surface and poop up there, then that poop has a whole bunch of iron in it, which is great for the plankton. So in this particular case, and probably in quite a bunch of others, the cetaceans can be a real boon to primary productivity, which obviously increases the levels of everything in the ocean, and also is fixating more carbon from the atmosphere, which is something we really need to do at the moment. So that's great. And in the Antarctic case, I find it particularly interesting because kind of it looks like down in these deep Antarctic waters, the key, the top of the food chain down there is the colossal squid, this enormous squid that we know very little about. If you look, I did a few years ago look at the data, and I couldn't find anything else that ate colossal squid except sperm whales. Mm-hmm. So they have this unique role to get all the nutrients in the colossal squid back up to the surface. And so modern whaling enormously reduced the number of sperm whales in the Antarctic, probably more than anywhere else, because these are male sperm whales, which were the primary target of 20th century whaling. And so we hope that these populations will gradually rebuild, and there's a little bit of evidence that they're doing so, not as much as one would like. And if that's the case, then it's a little bit of good news for the Antarctic, which isn't getting a whole lot of good news at the moment.
Yeah, right. As does the planet. So it looks like that even if the influence on carbon flux by cetaceans or sperm whales or other species is only regional, there might be not a global effect on climate, but maybe a regional one. It may in the end turn out that by saving the whales, we are saving ourselves. That is something that is also a very new idea. So it is all about our connection and the connectivity in ecosystems on our planet.